Okay, welcome back for the second speaker of today. And we are talking about, the speaker will be talking about serving the public interest through the Public Interest Actuary. I like to let you know that yesterday in the closing session, Simon and Lusani have been elected and awarded a prize for the best paper in the series of, and that's a long stretch. So in the category professionalism, ethics, and actuarial education. So I first like to congratulate both Simon and Lusani for this award, and congratulations that you made that happen. Unfortunately, I didn't see any of you yesterday during the session, so it would have been even better if you would have been able to collect your award in person. But now we have the opportunity to hear what your paper is about, and I won't take much more of your time. So you will do a dual presentation, Simon and Lusani. Simon is currently a part-time senior lecturer in the actuarial science at Stellenbosch University and part-time consulting actuary. He has 26 years of experience, mainly in the South African life insurance industry. He qualified as a fellow of the Actuarial Society of South Africa in 2003, and in 2009, he obtained a Master of Arts degree in the subject of applied ethics. His research interests include applied ethics in the actuarial, professional, and insurance domains, and risks and capital modeling and management for insurers. And then we have Lusani Mulaudzi, and I hope I pronounce right. Lusani is a healthcare actuary, independent non-executive director and lecturer. He's a trained design thinking practitioner and is passionate about innovation. He has worked as a CEO of a healthcare administrator and managed care organization, worked as healthcare actuary of large healthcare administrator and managed care organization, and as an actuarial consultant for a large insurance company in South Africa. He is an independent non-executive director for a couple of private insurance companies and does public interest work for the Actuarial Society of South Africa. In 2020, he joined the University of Cape Town as a lecturer, and in addition to his professional work, Lusani has been involved in the leadership structures of several community development organizations. Please join me in welcoming Simon and Lusani to the floor. Go ahead.
Great, thanks very much, Michael, and thanks very much for the punt on the paper. We're very proud and very excited. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world right now. It is so thrilling to be with you, a global audience in multiple locations. It's hard to imagine a few years back such a large virtual gathering would not have been common. My name is Simon Louw. Today, I will begin with the background to this topic, namely the public interest responsibility of the actuarial profession. I will then briefly explain some practices from associations around the world. Thereafter, Lusani will take over and explain the public interest strategy of the Actuarial Society of South Africa, our home association. We will use the acronym ASSA to refer to this association. This leads Lusani to a discussion of the governance and activities around this strategy, followed by the context, opportunities, and challenges that this presents. I will close with some concluding remarks. Serving the public interest is central to the actuarial profession. Given this, the first question to ask is, what is the public interest? This is not easily answered, and a clear definition remains elusive. There are many ways to analyze this question. For example, we can look at what activities support the public interest, or what the goals of such activities are. With this lens, we consider it useful to view conceptions of the public interest in a range from narrow to broad. A narrow conception for the actuarial profession is one of providing services to clients to an acceptable standard and within legal bounds, as a service to the public. As we move broader, the view expands from the individual to larger groups. A very broad conception of the public interest encompasses the goal of human flourishing. There are other ways to view the public interest, some of which are touched on in the paper. Despite the difficulty in defining the public interest, we must ask ourselves, how is this commitment by the profession to be met? There are a number of possible ways. For example, it might entail a desire to contribute to the well-being of society, as per the IAA's vision, a broad conception. Or it might be met by individual actuaries obeying the law and adhering to a code of conduct and professional standards, a narrow conception. Somewhere on this spectrum lies public policy work, which is our current focus. Before we continue, I need to state a few assumptions and limitations of our research. We are looking at the public interest responsibility of the profession or the actuarial association, and not that of individual members. We are not considering the questions of whether there is a public interest duty for the profession or whether there should be such a duty. We assume both are true for the current purpose. The analysis is qualitative and conceptual, using only publicly available information and personal experience. It is not intended to be rigorous or exhaustive. And lastly, the views expressed by us are ours only, and not that of ASSA, nor our employers. For our research, we undertook a selective scan of some actuarial associations around the world. These were the IAA, the Actuarial Association of Europe, the Institute of Actuaries of Australia, the American Academy of Actuaries, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, and of course, the Actuarial Society of South Africa, ASSA. This desktop-based research revealed the following. All associations in the sample include public interest in their aim, mission, constitution, or similar document. For example, the IAA and the AAE's visions refer to contributing to the well-being of society. The Constitution of the Institute of Actuaries of Australia includes several references to both the public interest and the protection of the public. Public interest is also present in the codes of conduct for members. This is unsurprising, since the IAA's regulations require all member associations to include in their codes of conduct a requirement that an actuary shall act in a manner that fulfills the profession's responsibility to the public. However, none of the associations in the sample clearly defined what public interest is, and this is likely due to the difficulties mentioned previously. Looking to public policy, we found pervasive activity on this front. The degree varied, but there is substantial public policy activity overall. The American Academy of Actuaries seems to go the furthest. The Academy has a dedicated public policy page on their website, which includes public policy news, statements grouped into various categories, research and practice notes. Despite this work, the governance around undertaking this by these associations was generally not fully documented. For example, the IAA has a due process for making a public statement document, but this does not cover all work and has some gaps. The Actuaries Institute has a detailed public policy framework, but lacks a description of the governance around such work. However, they do have a public policy council committee. The American Academy has a guidelines for making public statements. The Canadian Institute has a policy on public statements as well as a public affairs council. I will return to these observations in my conclusion. For now, I hand over to Lusani to tell us about ASSA's response. Lusani?
Thank you very much. I know I should be saying good evening, I should be saying good morning, I should be saying good afternoon to some of you. It's good morning here in South Africa. My role here is to talk about how ASSA has responded to this, with an acknowledgement that not all of the what constitute public interest is included in what we do in the public interest strategy. there's a part of public interest that is handled by the broader society or the broader actuarial society. What we focus on in this public interest strategy is more our interaction with policymakers. So what's ASSA seeks to inform, policy debates. What has been happening for many years, and I think that's part of the parliamentary process in South Africa, that before certain pieces of legislation are finalized, they have to go through hearings, community hearings, or get submissions from professionals. So often the Actuarial Society of South Africa will be requested to make inputs into that. And that can be somewhat difficult if one is not, hasn't done work on that. So the kind of inputs can tend to be shallow. But if a lot of research has been done, then a lot more detailed feedback can be given, also a lot more detailed input can be given. So this function, or this public interest strategy, acknowledges that. So what it does, it looks at conducting research or commissioning targeted relevant research, and with the hope of building relationship with key stakeholders. It's a lot better to actually influence that policy process before it's actually sent out for people to comment, so you can have the to and fro process. So the Public Interest Actuary was hired or appointed to formulate and execute the public interest strategy. It's currently a part-time role, which I occupy. In 2020, I was appointed in 2019 as the first Public Interest Actuary. In 2021, we adopted a public interest strategy, which I played a big part in putting together. It articulates a co-creation approach. So in looking at what the aim is of this public interest portfolio, I had to find an approach, a way to define an approach, how we're going to go about it. So we looked at two aspects. One is co-creation, and one is just mobilizing members to do relevant research, in the hope that when such an issue arises, when there's a legislative process around that issue, that we can have more facts as we engage in that. Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of the governance aspect of it, as you would imagine, when you're dealing with these policy matters, things can go wrong, and one's view does not necessarily represent the view of the members of the society. So to govern that, we have a Public Interest Governance Committee, and I must say that by the time when I was the president of the society, there was a view that there could be a conflict in the two roles. So it was actually quite necessary to have a Public Interest Governance Committee, that although I was the chair of the council, which is the highest decision-making body, I would still be in my role as a Public Interest Actuary subject to the Public Interest Governance Committee, which was made up mainly of very senior actuaries, including some members of council as well. And in the Public Interest Governance Committee itself reports to the Stakeholder Board, which in turn reports to Council. So ultimately, I was reporting to myself, but the Public Interest Governance Committee was a bridge to ensure that there's sufficient governance of that, which governed my contract, which I have with the society, and also the kind of focus areas that we have. So as I've mentioned, the activities that we have are more research focused, because that just creates a platform for us to interact with policymakers. And one good example of that is the problem of medical negligence claims against the state, which is a big problem, causes budget havoc in terms of the budgetary process in South Africa. We've been very involved in that. We prepared a research report back in 2021, and there's a commission that is helping the government to create a law to govern the entire space. And that commission made use of our research report. And when we had a public interest seminar, we could unpack both reports. And what we have done since the commission published its report, we've been working on the recommendations that they've made. We're looking at their recommendations. We're costing them. We're seeing how they could be implemented. We're doing the technical aspects of that, because sometimes a recommendation is a bullet point in a sort of a proposal, but if you were to unpack it, you find that there are a whole lot of complexities involved in that. So that's the kind of work that we are doing. We have sessional meetings to engage with our members on some of these issues, and we have public interest seminars also to engage more broadly with the policymakers. Next slide. It's a quite a South African context, as you've heard us we talk about load shedding. I think we just entered into load shedding now. Issues around electricity supply shortages, high unemployment, and so these are some of the issues that actuaries would not necessarily get involved in directly. But we're challenging ourselves to do that. We've produced reports on this. So we will be having a public interest seminar in a couple of days' time, where we will be unpacking some of the reports that we prepared in this space. So it's a highly complex space, a lot of challenges, but it's a good opportunity for us to actually be involved in the planning aspect of it, costing, risk management, designing, and essentially the management of trade-offs, because public policy is really about the trade-offs when you look at equity and you look at efficiency. So it puts us in that space, but it has to be a multidisciplinary process. Next slide. Yeah, so a lot of challenges, long iterative process. It's not a quick, you go in, you've got a solution and you go out. It can be a relationship that has to continue for 2-3 years. A lot of conflicts to manage. Industry may have its position on certain issues, but we don't go into these discussions with a view of what the outcome should be. We are more open-minded when we do this, maintaining objectivity in public pronouncements. And there are quite a lot of topics that one could tackle, but focusing on a few, just selecting those is a challenge in itself. And there isn't professional guidance notes, but the hope is that as we do this work, we'll be able to develop that, so people that come to do this work afterwards would have something to work with. So I'll hand over to Simon to conclude for us. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Lusani. Actuarial professions serve the public interest through, amongst others, participation in public policy debate. The associations in our sample were active in this field in varying degrees. The nature of the public interest work also varies. For example, focus only on actuarial matters or industry matters, or looking further into broad public policy issues, such as Lusani mentioned. This work presents opportunities, but also comes with significant and complex challenges. For our research and the challenges identified in the South African context, we recommend the following items be considered in public policy work. Associations should devise and publish a policy or framework specifically related to the public policy work to ensure appropriate governance over the process and outcomes. Consideration should be given to measures or guidance to deal appropriately with potential conflicts of interest. This is likely to be challenging, and further work is required on this point. This work generally costs money, and the funding thereof should be considered. For example, we feel that, in general, funding from outside the profession should not be considered for public policy work to reduce possible accusations of bias or conflict. The governing body of the association should take responsibility for the spending and should report back to members on it. That brings me to a close. Thank you very much for listening. We are excited to hear your views and questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. And you have also provided the paper, and I guess the paper is also available for people who like to understand better. Maybe I have difficulty seeing the chat, but I don't see any questions coming in the chat. But let me ask a first question to you. You've investigated the ASSA as an example. Are you aware of any other association that should follow the example that you have described? In other words, where is ASSA maybe different, and what may be the reason for that? And you already touched on that in the sense that Africa or South Africa has a special kind of political and kind of other environment, which makes things more difficult. But the question maybe is, how could your example be used in other jurisdictions and countries?
Simon, if you don't mind, I can answer that. Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think it's part of the responsibility. The actuarial profession in our country does attract very bright people. And it makes sense for such people to be involved in the public policy making process, but obviously they need to prepare themselves to be able to do that. So if I look at other developing nations, especially in Africa, there may be a need as well for, but the challenge they have is that they do have fewer actuaries. So the fewer actuaries that they do have a lot of work to do in the traditional sectors, in the financial services industry and so on. But such countries would also benefit from these considerations. And I must underline the fact that this has to be multidisciplinary work. So you have to be working with the other disciplines, the economists, the sociologists, etc. So I think that's where you may have a need. In more developed countries, I'm not best placed to comment on whether I think there's a need there, but there may be certain sort of more developing newer areas, like climate change, as we've spoken about, fourth industrial revolution, and so on. Those type of changes are not well understood by any of the professions or any one profession. So there, I think there is a need for professions to work together, and therefore, in that sense, actuaries to be involved in such discussions, and take somewhat of a lead as well, not just allow to have the conversation framed elsewhere, and for them to just continue to do just the technical bits. And we do allow ourselves to be led by what the policymakers are thinking, but at the same time, we do allow ourselves to challenge ourselves in that process. So that's why we talk about co-creation. So it's not as if everything is done and dusted. And what we don't want to do is to impose our agenda on the policymakers. But we do want them to trust us enough to have an engagement with them almost as equals. But obviously that's always a challenge. So that's how I would answer that question. Thank you.
If I may add,
yeah, sure,
please. Thank you. What's so fascinating about this process is Lusani and I sometimes are on opposing sides of this debate, which has made for some really interesting discussion. I think the applicability of an appointed actuary specifically in this role will depend on, say, the size of the association. And the scope. So ASSA is globally not too small, but not the largest association, and hence we do not have the capacity to employ teams of people to focus specifically on public policy matters, unlike, say, the American Academy, and I also understand the IFOA has a team as well on public policy. So it depends, I would say, on that, and also the scope. Some associations may be more limited to home matters, and some may be more broader, like the IAA. I think it also depends on the nature of the public policy work, which we didn't pull out too clearly, but some associations, like I mentioned, focus more narrowly, shall I say, on technical matters, on actuarial issues, whereas the ASSA, as Lusani explained, has moved into very broad public issues, dealing with electricity and unemployment and medical negligence and a whole bunch of issues that we would not traditionally have looked at. And for that reason, it was necessary to have a person appointed in that role. Thanks.
Okay, that was very, very helpful. That brings me to another question, and maybe still waiting for others to come in. You say that an actuary has the skill set to assist with these activities. Can other professionals not do that? So what puts actuaries in the unique position to have that role?
I wouldn't say unique or unique in sort of in its entirety, but there's certainly the actuaries can add value to the discussion, and also there is a need for upskilling as well. I've had to do a course with the London School of Economics on public policy, just to understand what is the framework there, what do they consider, and how do they measure success. And so I understand that. So in doing that, I identified quite a number of things. The experimental design aspects, which we do in statistics and so on, so you understand the importance of that. But also cost-benefit analysis itself is quite useful in that space. So in doing cost-benefit analysis, just a normal NPV, yes, there may be other professions that could do that, but we know that that is something quite foundational in the work that we do, NPV. But just to be able to do those calculations wouldn't necessarily mean that we are experts in that, because there are a whole lot of there's a whole lot that one needs to understand around the assumptions. I mean, just something like a social discount rate. I mean, I've had to do quite a bit of reading just to understand how one looks at that and how one approaches that. So I found that there is a whole lot more to learn when one is involved in the space. But because of the kind of people we are, and a very selective pool, we are the kind of people that can learn quite quickly. So it's not just saying we have the ready-made skills. It's saying that the intellectual innate ability or the training is there to even learn more and add value in the space. And we do, and I do emphasize the issue of multidisciplinary, and that's important to appreciate how the other professions add value. It's so important to know where where our capacity sort of starts and end, and then value the value that others bring, and even the value that politicians bring to the table. So you would often hear people saying, politicians are not the smartest people on earth, but I mean, if you were to measure on the side of, emotional, intelligence, I mean, you have to have a lot of emotional intelligence to survive in that space. So I find that I do have quite a lot of respect for politicians as well. So, and we need them. If you want to have very good policies out there, you're going to need very good politicians. So it's very good for us to understand that we need to enable that process. So that's how I look at it. I don't look at us as being the king of the castle, but really as being very, very useful in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon, anything to add there?
Yes, I mean, you've highlighted a key question which I had and which prompted me to look into this and have those discussions with Lusani is how can actuaries add value when dealing with something like, say, unemployment versus the economists? But Lusani is in his own way getting me more and more convinced that it's necessary, certainly in our context, and there's a need to involve the profession in the country's problems. I mean, if we don't have people employed, we don't have an industry. So it is also in our self-interest to do this as well. But thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Just to add on that, if you look at the role that we play as advisors, for instance, in terms of investments, when you understand the unemployment challenge, for instance, you then an understanding of what could lead to a better situation may influence even the kind of advice you give to some of the funds that you give advice to. And there are actuaries in South Africa that are doing that, working in alternative investment space and just as pension fund advisors, and having a better understanding of how a country can invest in order to deal with that problem. So this can be approached from different angles.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one short reaction. We have less than 1 minute left. Kind of why a part-time role? It seems so a lot of activities. So you at least a full-time role and not part-time.
I'm conflicted. I can't be the one to answer that question. I do agree with you that it's a lot of work that needs to be done. There are quite a number of things that one needs to consider. We do make use of other actuaries as researchers, and that's the strategy we've been pushing. And then it may just be that maybe we need to have another public interest actuary so that this sort of permeates than be centralized in me as an individual. So those are things that we will consider as we look at the 2024 strategy going forward. So that's a very, very valid question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 10 seconds left. So I think I'd like to thank you another time for your excellent paper and your excellent presentation. And for the others, please bear with us. We cut you off shortly, but we will be back after a short while with the last speaker of today.